I'm Janice Helland. I'm head of Art History and Art Conservation and one of the co-organizers of the conference. So thank you for coming. And this morning, it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome Beverly Lemire to this conference. Since 2004, Beverly has been professor and Henry Marshall Torrey Chair, Department of History and Classics, and Department of Human Ecology, University of Alberta. And she was the founding director of the Material Culture Institute, also at U of A. During the course of her career, she has received fellowships and awards from SSHRC, from Oxford, from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the National University of Australia, the Huntington Library, to name but a few. And she has published widely and impressively. Her publications include the 2011 book Cotton, in the series Textiles That Changed the World. She edited the inspiring collection, The Force of Fashion in Politics and Society, Global Perspectives from Early Modern to Contemporary Times in 2010, which was shortlisted for an award from the Costume Society of America. She wrote the acclaimed The Business of Everyday Life, Gender, Practice, and Social Politics in England, circa 1600 to 1900, published in 2005. These titles represent only a fraction, of her work and do not even touch upon her book chapters and articles, which are far too numerous to list. But I'd like to refer to a few to give you a sense of Beverly's wide-reaching interests and immense intellect. History and the Consumer, A Historian of the West Looks to Japan, 2012. Portugal, India, and the European Home, Reshaping European Material Culture, circa 1500 to 1700, 2010. Draping the Body and Dressing the Home, The Material Culture, of Textiles and Clothing in the Atlantic World, 1500 to 1800, 2009. Beverly's current, very intriguing research focuses on sailors, men of the word, British mariners, consumer practice and material culture in an era of global trade, 1600 to 1800, published in April of this year. And another, A Question of Trousers, Seafarers, Masculinity and Empire in the Shaping of British male dress, circa 1600 to 1800, forthcoming in January 2016. Her in-progress, recently funded SSHRC project, a partnership development grant, will resonate with those attending this conference. I want to quote briefly from the project's website, but I urge you to check it out yourselves. You can search objectlives.com. And this is a quote from the website. Objects, Lives, and Global Histories in Northern North America, 1700s to 2000s, is a collaborative research project with Edmonton and Montreal as the geographic hubs for its inquiry. This project will explore the histories of material culture within these regions, linked to the wider global flows of influence that arise from trade, colonialism, and migration, unquote. And I'd like to draw your attention to the call for papers for their forthcoming conference, Dressing Global Bodies, Clothing, Cultures, Politics, and Economies in Globalizing Eras, 1600 to 1900s, which will be held at the University of Alberta, 7 to 9 July 2016, and brochures for that are available at the registration desk. And now, with what has been actually a somewhat long but very modest introduction, given Beverly's accomplishments, please welcome Professor Beverly Lemire.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure and privilege to meet you here today. I want to thank the organizers, and particularly the local organizer, Janice Helland. And I'd like to acknowledge as well, as someone who comes from Edmonton, from Treaty 6, that we are meeting on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and Algonquian peoples, First Nations territory. I am fascinated, as you may have gathered, by the cross-cultural intermixing that came with the early globalizing era, with the material conversations that arose from many locales as peoples and goods came in contact as never before. The power of this process in traditional history is often measured in the size of European corporate profits and maritime fleets. That's not my interest. Other measures address shifting aesthetic practice, the blending and refiguring of styles and material goods, and peoples as they remade their everyday lives. Today, I assess the evidence of women's creative lives, virtual portraits, if you will, in spaces traveled and materials created. Women forged connections and effected translations revealed in many material forms. Close study of material culture can reveal gendered connections and new vocabularies of design, giving voice to populations often mute in historical narratives. Needlewomen usually left few other accounts of their lives other than these. These were a population commonly unlettered, but I emphasize that word, unlettered, not illiterate. The distinction is key, as it foregrounds the shared interpretive capacities of women in a wide variety of locales, increasingly touched by globalized objects and motifs. Women in many societies were urged to write with their needles, often restrained from other sorts of chronicles. In the period I study, skills in symbolic literacy were sharply honed. Many women artfully deployed objects and symbols, evident particularly when deployed through needle and thread. The early global era was distinctive in many ways, and I realize that most of you study a more contemporary time. The distinctive features of the early global era included the growing stream of materials circulating the globe, particularly Indian cottons, Chinese silks, and porcelains. These were exceptional conduits of design, enriching visual environments. These products flowed across vast spaces, arriving in the hands of slave and free, washerwomen and sailors, domestic servants and merchants from Asia to the Americas. Chris Gosden writes of the, in his words, effects that things have on people. Today, I explore women's material connections with the global. Their interpretations and representations reshaped their material cultures and refashioned their lives. I'll first outline for you, and very briefly, global trade in this era. In the 1490s, when Vasco da Gama anchored on the west coast of India, as he did, he encountered a highly developed commercial system tying, at that point, the China Seas with the Mediterranean world. The new oceanic trade network that developed thereafter was described by K.N. Chaudhry as part of an important new development of a long-distance trade network. Chaudhry writes that long-distance trade also subsumes an exchange of information on cultural values and interpretations, social system, technology, and artistic sensibilities. Chaudhry adds that global connections are instrumental in the creation of a language of signs with an immense range of significance. Those are my focus here. By 1500, then, Asian designs already reflected hybrid influences. These now evolved further and became a hallmark of the early global era. Communications intensified through the flow of goods and people. This history transcended nations and empires in many respects. The tide of goods flowed over and beyond regulated commercial networks. The men, women, and children who loaded and unloaded and sailed these ships traded for goods or were traded themselves, also bartered, bought, owned, used, stole, and adapted these wares. They reinterpreted these objects in diverse cultural contexts, employing varied aesthetic, spiritual, and cultural criteria in their object use. Robert Finlay terms porcelain the pilgrim art in describing its circulation and its import as it crossed continents and oceans, arguing for the unique importance of Chinese porcelain as a means of cross-cultural exchange, a platform on which design was read, revised, reinterpreted, and renewed. Porcelain possessed other qualities as well, notably temporality. I'm sure we all know that. Ceramics are inherently breakable, and this imbued them with attention as sellers, owners, and users shipped, bought, and replenished their stores. So I think we must recognize the layered categories of Asian materials circulating the globe. These, and isn't this fabulous? These were integral to the history I describe here, a depiction of a Chinese export shop in the Netherlands in the late 17th century. So I want us to consider the layered influences of goods coming from Asia. For change did not depend on a single material influence from a single source. Powerful effects were achieved through the combined impact of complementary material systems and the routine layered interactions of material cultures. India produced the other vital global commodity, cotton textiles. These were used from the China Seas to the Red Seas by the 10th century. After 1500, plain, but as well patterned, painted, printed, and embroidered cotton goods came to Iberia by ship and were thereafter moved by Portuguese traders to Northern Europe and its colonies. These fabrics unsettled established norms with their feel, with their colors, and with their look. They offered tutorials in design, if you like, evidence of new ways of thinking about pattern and the pleasures of combining varied aesthetic elements. European colonial powers thereafter carried Asian wares through North and West Africa, across the Pacific from Manila to Acapulco, as well as crossing the Atlantic to many sites in the Americas. For example, the Hudson's Bay Company brought painted calico shirts to York Factory in the 1680s, perhaps patterned something like these somewhat later garments, and you have to admit they're a bit of a wow. Textiles and ceramics were thus seen, touched, and arranged in recurring ceremonies of daily life, and they inspired. Textiles were one of the most important categories of cargoes for Europeans trading in Asia and globally. And in this respect, we must recognize the agency of the goods themselves. And I emphasize this point, the agency of the goods themselves. And in the next several slides, I'm going to be showing you, that's a palanquin, which would be a hanging in a bedroom or hallway. They're mostly high-end, because that's what survives, painted, printed, and embroidered. The agency of things, here, a beautifully embroidered fragment. The agency of things is now a widely accepted premise, what Chris Gosden describes as, in his words, part of an emerging attempt to take the material world seriously in terms of how it affects human relations. The power of patterned textiles lay in their capacity to communicate with signs and designs viewed and used and reinterpreted across cultures. Indeed, the power of global trade shaped people in many ways. Batavia, present-day Jakarta, was the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company. The initials typically used are the VOC, which was the abbreviation for the Dutch form of that company name, which I won't attempt to say. So, Batavia. It was also the site of numerous multi-ethnic households, permanent or semi-permanent, where cultural mixing took place and material innovation followed. The wives and concubines of VOC officials were local women of various ethnicities, Japanese, Chinese, Javanese, Balinese, or Eurasian. In these households, Clothing systems, foods, and furnishings were negotiated. Laura Piers describes the intimate contact zones of multi-ethnic families in her analysis of 19th century Métis embroidered bag. She describes this intimate contact zone was a contact zone that was, in her words, not a place or an abstract concept or a space to experience strangeness, but something which existed within themselves in the marriages of their parents or in the marriages themselves. This type of contact zone was multiplied countless times in many other places and other periods, suggested in this family portrait. Produced in Batavia in 1665, it presents Peter Knoll, senior merchant of the VOC in Batavia, and his wife Cornelia, 2 daughters, and 2 domestic slaves. I focus on Cornelia in my remarks on this portrait here, and consider the material culture shaped by her life experiences, as demonstrated in this portrait. Cornelia was born in Hirado in Japan in the 1620s to a Japanese mother and a Dutch VOC father. She spent years in her natal land, doubtless trained as a female child whose expectations lay between 2 cultures. Her life demanded practical as well as polished skills. Her father bequeathed her wealth and required that she move from Japan to Batavia, bringing yet another young woman into a complex, multi-ethnic city. Cornelia married well, ultimately overseeing a prestigious household, all indications of which are shown in this portrait. Cornelia is garbed here according to the European aesthetic, yet I am sure that every fabric and trimming was likely of Asian origin. Symbolic references to the power of Asian trade are everywhere, a commerce that fashioned her life. Ships are notable in the far left horizon. The floral displays as well, in doubtless Chinese porcelain vases, are a trope of this globalized period, and you will have seen them already in the palampours that I've shown. The portrait captures the many exchanges enacted in Batavia, such as the pet dogs attending the daughters. Perhaps you didn't notice the dogs. Pay attention to the dogs. Were these Pekingese dogs, beloved by the Chinese imperial family, or perhaps a breed called Japanese chins? Toys for noble Japanese women and bred for size, coat, and color. Cornelia's self-fashioning is also demonstrated in her fan. We have to pay attention to the small stuff. Folding fans were invented in Japan centuries earlier, and the skill of local fan makers made these gestural confections a favorite in Asian locales, later noted and adopted by Europeans. Graceful or emphatic gestures were conveyed through fans in Japanese private life, in public events, and in theatrical displays. Some of you may know the kabuki, where fans are used widely. Cornelia and her daughters hold their fans prominently, a mnemonic of their Japanese ancestry. Her position was highlighted by the domestic slaves at her shoulder. The fans, pearls, and carved ivory box showcased in the Knoll family portrait reflect the diffusion of tastes and materials across cultures, show Cornelia's hand in this assembly, and suggest as well the power of the movement of people as well as goods in this process. I picked Cornelia as the beginning of my conversation here as a demonstration of the ways in which women traveled, as well as goods. Women traveled in commercial vessels across Asian waters and across the Pacific, as well as on sea routes to Europe. Cornelia arrived in Batavia in such a vessel, and ultimately, as a widow, journeyed to the Netherlands. She joined streams of other female sojourners, few as materially comfortable as she was herself. The majority of these women were of multi-ethnic origin, educated in Batavia or environs, educated or trained. They brought their histories, their goods, and their talents on these voyages, further evidence of contact and connection, what Natalie Davis terms cultural crossings. Cornelia's life is well documented, but for the many other women who journeyed between cultures, scant evidence of their passage survives. We can be assured, however, that they conveyed their skills and aesthetic sensibilities in their person, in their tastes, and in their pastimes. There are other traces of cultural crossings that demonstrate the creative intermixing that involved people as well as cargoes. Sea journeys were long and safe landings uncertain. However, routine scheduled sailings across the world's oceans marked a qualitative change in contact and connections. The women making these journeys, voluntarily or involuntarily, mediated new vocabularies of design and new hybrid material forms. Embroidery was a skill that increased the value of men and women in this era, and their travel is sometimes documented because of these talents. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, captive slaves with these talents were landed in Portugal, for example, including Japanese and Chinese men, plus Filipino women. Filipino female embroiderers were noted specialists in this trade. Why were they transported in this way, one might ask? In this period, skills were best transferred in the body of the person. Improving the output of Lisbon's embroidery workshops, which was the aim of this project, required the talents of Asian embroiderers who were carried to Iberia to work and train local needleworkers. This 17th century embroidered quilt, a small piece of which I'm showing you here. I didn't get the chance to pull the whole thing out. It's at the Royal Ontario Museum. This 17th century embroidered quilt was inspired by Indian examples, made in Portugal. We cannot know who set the stitches, but we know that Asian designs inspired other women, like the quilt embroiderers of Castelo Branco, Portugal. And the whole genre of Castelo Branco quilts became renowned in Lusitanian circles, including Portuguese colonial circles. Castelo Branco was a border region between Portugal and Spain. The quilts that were made there were a blend of many forces translated in this setting by these particular women. Translation is a useful word to describe a material environment in flux. We need to be attentive to these connections and conversations and the translations that ensued across cultures. Now, Peter Burke has talked about textual, not textile, but textual translation in a way that I think may apply to other forms. Burke writes that whether translators followed the strategy of domestication or of foreignizing, whether they understood or misunderstood the text they are turning into another language, the activity of translation necessarily involves both decontextualization and recontextualization. Stitches visualized knowledge systems. The circulation of Asian wares intruded into aesthetic, spiritual, and functional systems to be thereafter decontextualized and recontextualized in a myriad of world locales, not all of which I discuss here, obviously, or you'd be here all day. These translations took place in domestic environments, and I really have to emphasize the different spaces in which these translations took place, in domestic environments as well as commercial sites and workshops across the ecumen. Stitching was performative, learned, and articulated, expressing gender, rank, ethnicity, and time period, and we must be attentive to connections, but also to the disposition of each community. We can't essentialize the sites of stitchery or the agents of these generative processes. What marks this period was the absorption of aesthetic motifs, new vocabulary, I call it, added to local idioms, evoked by diverse women, linked by new networks. Translation revised design in global communities, and women were essential mediators in this process. So, how many embroiderers traveled the oceans? There's no muster list of needlewomen, as there were for crews on merchant ships. However, visual and archival sources do suggest other ways in which cultural connections were forged and aesthetic traditions adapted. Local servants as indicated here, worked for members of European East Indian trading companies during the periods that they resided in Asia. During the 1700s, Asian servants worked for and traveled with their masters, mistresses, and infant charges within Asia and between world ports as a matter of routine. Connections were made. Women as well as men made these journeys. We know too little of their histories. They cared for babes and children. They accompanied officers and gentlewomen over world oceans. Some spent years in Europe as employers settled into their new abodes. How was the collective and individual influence of these Asian sojourners expressed? Tony Bickham talks as food being in his words, at the heart of the British imperial experience in Britain itself. He remarks, for example, on the taste for curries in the 1700s, captured in cookbooks of that era. Knowledge systems intersected and material cultures were in flux in textiles that I'm focusing on here, but also in other ways. Whatever their ethnicities, female domestic servants sewed as a matter of course, as shown on the image to the left. We cannot know what they stitched or how this contributed to domestic comforts. But these homely tasks were certainly among their domestic duties, and doubtless some were also involved in collective tasks with their masters and mistresses. Katerina termed a black servant in a letter to the English East India Company cared for a child on her voyage to London over months in 1767. Another Indian woman named Subina, a black nurse, attended a child for another family, perhaps being a member of the household in Bengal before they relocated to England. These connections denote other ways in which material culture of one world region was transposed and translated in another. Did they teach their young charges stitchery? Did they help with collective embroidery projects? We cannot know. Certainly, Asian servants reinforced the tastes acquired in Asia by Europeans. Documentation is slight but suggestive, outlining the multi-layered interactions in Europe, Asia, and colonial settings. The presence and contributions of these women cannot be ignored. As Canadians, we are familiar with the histories and material production of Métis women, some of which we heard and Indigenous women, some of which we heard in wonderful sessions yesterday, including their renowned embroidery, which also figured within this global history. There are parallels among world regions that bear noting. Practices evolved and taste changed in foods and fashions, shaped by and shaping slave and free, laborer and gentry, colonial, indigenous, and metropolitan subjects. I'm now going to turn to the aesthetics of flora and fauna as a type of cultural and gendered refashioning. And that's a bit of a peach, isn't it? Asian style, that's Asian inspired. Asian style flora, fauna, and object systems are more commonly referenced in Western and colonial embroideries from the mid-1500s onwards, as were those of the Americas. These melded with existing European floral cultures, gendered knowledge systems, and cosmologies that remained generative, I'm talking about the European ones, that remained generative into the 19th century. And we need to keep that point clear. Jack Goody, the anthropologist, describes the varying boundaries of European floral cultures, in his words, at times cutting across socio-political units, but sometimes marking smaller collectivities. There was no single floral culture, but many, expressing social and gendered beliefs, thriving despite periodic religious objections, even as idioms evolved. Embroidered floral motifs reference systems of belief and cultural practice. Designs are touched by fashions, such as the one I show you here, and it isn't wonderful. It's not especially well done. That's why I like it. And I believe we should understand the choice of iconography within the widest cultural parameters. These goods served functional and effective purposes, sometimes being gifts. They signaled life cycle stages. They demonstrated prized female skills. That being so, we might expect that needlework of this kind would always be visible, a claim for prestige, a source of pride. Yet there is one female accessory, often embroidered in the Western European context in globalized floral style, whose use was concealed. Pockets. A few of you will know what these are. Pockets were hidden from the public eye. Barbara Berman argues for the pocket's sexualized meaning with a womb-like shape, 18 to 24 inches long, secured at the center of the female body. And for those of you who don't know where pockets were tied, and this style ran from about the late 17th century through the mid-19th century. Pockets were tied around the waist over the shift of virtual skin, and they were accessed through slits in the gown or petticoat. This allowed a unique material privacy and a unique management of self-selected goods to facilitate private and domestic life. What meanings can we then ascribe to the flowering and flowered pockets that survive? Okay, I had fun writing this. Now I'm getting into the speculative stage. Some of you will know of the custom of intentionally hidden garments in house walls in Scandinavia, northwestern Europe, and their colonies in the Americas and Australia. These intentionally hidden garments were typically found within walls by windows, doors, fireplaces, you get it, wherever there's an entry or a piercing of the building. This involved a ritual sacrifice, or a ritual, we can speculate, a ritualized sacrifice of the garment, which is cut or twisted, whose, it's suggested, whose hidden spiritual force was intended to protect the home's inhabitants once placed in the walls. We know about this practice not from any written record. There are no written records of this practice, only from surviving material evidence. The practice itself signals persistent customary beliefs that paralleled, interestingly, the Age of Enlightenment. Is there a similar symbolic intent with embroidered flowered pockets? How important are the floral designs in the articulation of femininity, of fecundity on women's pockets? Or are these purely aesthetic exercises devoid of cultural weight? Do embroidered pockets speak of a mastery of floral knowledge, a knowledge of a recognized female expertise in food and medical management that was still immensely important for women well through this period? Ruth Phillips inspired me when I read this. She was writing about the value of close analysis of First Nations artifacts, noting that, in her words, for more historically remote objects for which there are no continuously remembered traditions of interpretation, comparative art history methods of stylistic and iconographic analysis can reveal semiotic references or significatory intents in abstract motifs that have been regarded as merely decorative. I take this claim to heart and suggest we apply such analysis to non-Indigenous objects as well, and deny the merely decorative even as the decorative motifs change. The early global era is epitomized in the diffusion of hybrid Asian motifs, what becomes a somewhat shared vocabulary across the ecumen amidst the increased structural divisions of power. Naturally, these motifs were adapted and translated in new domains. However, floral culture remained a dynamic feature of European life and beliefs, European colonial life and beliefs. Flowers accompanied the bride to the altar. They were gifted to the dead. They were collected for medicinal, gustatory, and social uses, and they marked festivals and seasons. Andrew Morrill urges the close study of ornament as a means of understanding mentalities of past culture, recognizing that domestic ornament was, in his words, a language of some flexibility used to project a social identity, a civil or domestic ideal, to proclaim adherence to a social group or a set of values. The introduction of new flora from other parts of the world and new representations of these flora and the evolution of floral fashions cannot erase the complex cultural symbolism of these designs, not even in Europe. We may usefully speculate on priorities during the stitching of flowered pockets, even as they were hidden from sight. Global fashion might direct the choice of flowers and the performance of design, but did this aesthetic extinguish cultural affiliations? Cultural forms also directed new representative relationships with fauna. And I'm going to talk about parrots for a little while next to conclude this paper. Parrots also appeared as a matter of course in increasing numbers after the 1500s, a leitmotif alluding to long-distance Asian trade and indigenous America, real or imagined. Europeans developed a passion for parrots. Acquired in the Americas or Asia, the source was less important than their symbolism. The historian Marcy Norton recounts the differing sensibilities that distinguished bird ownership and bird culture between indigenous communities in colonial Spanish America and European bird owners. Young parrots were adopted by Mesoamerican indigenous families, a process managed by indigenous women as parrots became family members, a source of sacred feathers and friendship. Europeans had different bird relationships and valued parrots as a material exotic, with companionship of a different sort sometimes achieved. Those unable to purchase a parrot settled for representations. You may be able to see him somewhere up there in the branches. Bird care was gendered in Europe, hawks for men, chickens for women. Parrots became a type of hybrid bird, its imperial connotations claimed by European men and its companionship by women. A set of 17th century crewel work panels modeled on Indian palanpurs opens a window on the priorities of anonymous English makers. These were collective women's work reflecting shared intention. This one is filled with trees and vines in the manner of a tree of life. Parrots grace some of the branches, lotus flowers others. Sheep and cattle, however, are scattered in the bottom of this work, indicating the very particular prestige of these ruminant animals in British culture, pastoral culture. Collective projects can reveal aspirational and imperial sentiments, as well as the creative capacities of the makers. Embroiderers' inspiration likely came from their close, direct contact with Asian imports and with the careful study of the stylistic arrangement of trees, leaves, flowers, and animals. These goods were then assessed within cultural, spiritual, and life cycle systems. Beds furnished in these draperies, locally embroidered, offered a paraphrasing of Asian design while still addressing the fecundity and sexuality of the setting. Over time, however, the imitative connections to Asian wares became more blurred and diffuse, the content less and less like the original from Asia. There are many of these that survive in museums, reminders of the generation who assessed and decoded globalized goods and worked these motifs into ways that suited their world understandings. As Chris Gosden and Yvonne Marshall observe, as people and objects gather time, movement, and change, they are constantly transformed, and these transformations of person and objects are tied up with each other. I'm going to end with a few less spectacular embroideries. I'm especially intrigued by the countless humble stitchery exercises that survive in museums, demonstrating the catalyst provided to extant floral cultures and the aesthetic translation into Euro-American and Creole cultures. This 1686 embroidery confirms the powerful visual impact of ceramics and textiles on receiving audiences. A cotton linen fabric provides the foundation for this blue and white composition. The color choice is surely a tribute to the preeminence of blue and white porcelain. A central hillock is topped by a large rounded vase reminiscent of any number of Chinese porcelains we've seen here today, filled here with central iris and carnations, tulips, and other flowers. And, as you may already have noticed, 2 birds anchor the bottom, 1 a parrot in the corner. None of this is accidental. The initials RH acknowledge the hand of the embroiderer who domesticated her parrot in this very personal way. This rich confection marks the wider forces within which this personal project was stitched. Philadelphia resident Elizabeth Jeffries left a later record of her interpretive skills in the form of a crewel embroidery piece dated 1777. Elizabeth, too, was likely a girl or a young woman when drafting this image. The Palampour lineage is completely apparent in the configuration of this work, but in a simplified form with 2 abstracted branches on which, of course, perch 2 parrots amidst the requisite flowers. The results are rarely perfect in embroideries such as these. Perfection is not my focus. Rather, let us consider the intention of the makers, the choices made, and the motifs employed by generations of Asian, Eurasian, European, colonial, and indigenous women, considering as well the life forces and political forces shaping their works. Women embraced cultural offerings from complex world regions and reinterpreted them in shifting milieu. They were key agents in the processes that gripped large swaths of the world, providing a rich array of interpretations. Each community of embroiderers engaged with these globalized products in discrete ways. The Asian goods discussed here carried a wealth of malleable meanings adaptive to cultural translation. Women addressed the challenges of the age through both ocean voyages, the construction of hybrid households, and the creation of objects, reacting to changes that engulfed them. Power systems are suggested as well in these goods, as to our other possibilities, but close attention to the transcultural passage of goods is the first starting point, and attention to the creative production of women is the second, opening new kinds of material histories and reminding us of the myriad roles of women in the early globalized world. Thank you.